Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving headfirst into the high-stakes world of major engineering and construction contracts, specifically those governed by the FIDI Yellow Book. The focus today is Clause 15, which details exactly how the employer, that's the client, can legally end the project. We're really looking at the ultimate contract breakup.
It's more than just a breakup. It's a high-stakes financial strategy. I mean, when a massive project fails or, changes course, the legal framework dictates not just if you can terminate, but how you have to do it. And of course, what the financial fallout is. So
Yeah.
our mission today is to give you that strategic shortcut. We want to isolate the critical procedural steps and, I think most importantly, the massive financial difference between the two types of termination.
Absolutely. Because Clause 15 forces the employer down one of two, well, fundamentally different tracks. And mistaking one for the other is a financial and legal disaster waiting to happen. So we're tracking the punitive rote termination for contractor's default, where the contractor messes up, versus the compensatory route termination for employer's convenience, where the employer just decides to pull the plug.
And if you're the employer going down that punitive route, you almost always have to take a crucial first legal step. It's right there in the very first part of the clause.
The mandatory warning shot. This feels procedural, but isn't this the first point of, serious legal exposure?
It is the tripwire. Termination for default is rarely immediate. It almost always begins with the engineer issuing a formal notice to correct.
Okay.
This is the moment the clock really starts ticking, legally speaking. If the employer doesn't get this step perfectly right, any termination they try later can be challenged immediately.
So what makes this warning legally sound? If you're preparing this notice, what are the non-negotiables?
Okay, so you must clearly identify the failure. What exactly did the contractor do wrong? Second, you have to cite the specific contract provision that was violated. That's key. And third, you must specify a reasonable time within which that failure must be fixed. And that idea of reasonable time is, well, it's ripe for dispute.
That's where the risk is, isn't it? If the engineer demands the contractor fix some massive structural issue in, say, 48 hours, that timing is just unreasonable. The contractor could argue the whole termination is invalid because that prerequisite wasn't met.
Precisely. The engineer has to take due regard of the nature of the failure and, the sheer amount of work required to actually fix it. Now, if the contractor gets that notice, they can't just ignore it. They have to respond immediately with an action plan, outlining what measures they'll take and the exact date they'll start those measures to comply. It forces an immediate response.
And this is so crucial for any contractor hoping for a bit of a scheduling break. Receiving a notice to correct absolutely does not grant any extension of the time for completion.
No, not at all.
It's a legal warning about a breach, not a schedule adjustment.
Correct. It's purely a procedural prerequisite to escalation.
Okay. Now, let's assume that warning shot has been fired, or maybe the breach is so bad it bypasses the warning. What are the ultimate grounds, the really serious sins, that let the employer start a termination for default?
Yeah, the grounds are, they're pretty extensive, but you can group them into 4 categories: procedural, performance, financial, and ethical. The most direct route is simply the failure to remedy that initial breach after getting the notice to correct. We also see failure to comply with binding determinations, like from the engineer or a decision from the dispute board, as long as that failure is a material breach.
So not just arguing about a small payment, but a fundamental refusal to comply with the ruling on a major dispute.
Exactly. Then you get the performance failures. This covers things like abandoning the works or, just clearly showing an intention not to continue the project. The contract also gives you a quantitative and objective trigger: unexcused failure to proceed that leads to delay damages that will ultimately exceed the maximum amount in the contract data.
So when you hit the cap on liquidated damages.
When you hit the cap, at that point, the employer has the right to terminate for performance failure.
And what about quality? I mean, if the contractor is building things poorly and just refusing to fix them.
That's termination trigger D. If the contractor fails to comply with a rejection notice or an engineer's instruction for remedial work, things like, tearing out defective parts, and they don't do it within 28 days, that's a ground for default.
So these are the conditional defaults, the ones that usually follow a warning. But then you have the immediate red flag breaches, the ones that show a complete collapse of integrity or capacity.
Right, these are the go nuclear grounds, the non-remediable offenses. Immediate red flags include failing to comply with performance security requirements or improperly subcontracting the entire job. Then you have the insolvency triggers, bankruptcy, liquidation, things like that. And that applies even to a single member of a joint venture unless the other partners immediately commit to fulfilling the entire obligation.
And the final one, which seems designed for, well, immediate expulsion, is the ethical breach.
Absolutely. The employer can terminate instantly if the contractor is found, based on reasonable evidence, to have engaged in corruption, fraud, collusion, any of that, at any time. And these are the three exceptions: fraud, insolvency, and improper assignment, that let the employer bypass the standard 14-day grace period.
That distinction is crucial. Let's talk about the mechanics of the termination itself. For most breaches, it's still a two-step dance, right?
That's the mandatory 14-day warning process, yes. For most of these, the employer first issues a notice of intent to terminate. The contractor then gets a final 14 days to fix the matter. If those 14 days pass and the issue is still there, well, then the employer issues a second notice to immediately terminate. And the termination date is the date the contractor gets that second notice.
But those immediate red flag breaches, the fraud, the insolvency, those skip the 14 days entirely.
They do. In those cases, the employer's initial termination notice is the final act. Termination is immediate. It's an expedited route because the relationship is seen as, well, fundamentally destroyed.
Once that termination notice lands, the contractor has a pretty daunting list of immediate obligations. What do they have to do?
They have to immediately comply with instructions for assigning subcontracts or for the urgent protection of life, property, or safety of the works. And critically, the contractor must immediately deliver all required goods, all their design documents, all contractor's documents to the engineer. That IP has to be handed over right away.
And if they try to linger on site?
They have to leave. If they fail to comply, the employer has the legal right to expel them and take possession of the site.
So the employer isn't just ending the contract, they're basically seizing the project to finish it. What rights do they get?
They get massive leverage, which is the whole point of this punitive termination. The employer can complete the works themselves or get others to do it, and they are legally entitled to use any of the existing goods and, crucially, all of the contractor's documents and designs created by the former contractor. They essentially seize the design IP needed to get a new contractor up and running.
And what about the contractor's physical assets? Their cranes, their temporary buildings? This sounds like the ultimate power play.
Well, the equipment and temporary works stay on site for a while. After the project is eventually finished, the employer lets the contractor know that the items are released for removal. The contractor has to do that promptly at their own risk and cost. But here is the ultimate power of sale. If the contractor ends up owing the employer money, the employer can actually sell the contractor's equipment and temporary works to recover that payment.
Wow. Okay, that sets the stage for the financial reckoning. This is where the punitive nature of default really hits home.
This is where the employer saves money and the contractor suffers a massive financial loss. The valuation under subclause 15.3 is very narrow. The engineer determines the value of permanent works and goods, but only for work done in accordance with the contract.
So if you're a contractor and you installed, say, 10,000 compliant widgets and 500 faulty ones, you only get credits for the 10,000. The 500 faulty ones are just zeroed out.
Precisely. The valuation explicitly excludes the value of anything: documents, materials, plant, works, to the extent that they do not comply with the contract. And this is a massive point of dispute, as you can imagine. The definition of compliant becomes very subjective in a high-pressure situation like this.
And even if that limited valuation shows the employer owes the contractor something, they don't have to pay it right away.
Yeah.
They could just withhold it.
That's the strategic lockup of funds. Under 15.4, the employer may withhold any payment due until all costs, losses, and damages they've suffered are established. This whole calculation creates a debt owed by the contractor to the employer based on three major charges.
Okay, walk us through that debt calculation. This is the punitive core.
First, the contractor pays the additional costs of executing the rest of the works with a new contractor. This is calculated after allowing for any sum that might have been due to the contractor under that very limited valuation. Second, the employer gets compensated for any other general losses and damages they suffered.
And the third payment is unique. It's a retroactive penalty on time.
It is. It's the resurrection of delay damages. If the works weren't taken over and the termination date is after the original time for completion, the contractor has to pay delay damages calculated daily for every single day that passed between the original completion night and the date the contract was terminated.
So it ensures the employer is fully compensated for all the time lost right up until they took over the site. Okay, so we've detailed the punitive, expensive for the contractor route. Now let's shift gears completely. Let's talk about termination for employer's convenience. This is the clean break, but it's a lot more expensive for the employer. Why would they ever choose this?
Well, an employer chooses this route when the project is just no longer viable for them, for reasons that have nothing to do with the contractor's performance. Maybe a huge financing package fell through, or a government regulator canceled a permit. The employer is basically unilaterally buying their way out of the contract.
It's the polar opposite of default. And because the employer is terminating without cause, they have immediate substantial obligations to protect the contractor financially.
Exactly. The very first thing the employer must do is immediately return the contractor's performance security. That security is, the contractor's financial hostage, and it has to be released right away. The employer also has to relinquish the right to use any more of the contractor's documents, and they have to be returned, except for designs they've already fully paid for.
So the contractor gets their financial backing back, and they get their intellectual property back.
And they get time to demobilize. The termination isn't immediate. It takes effect 28 days after the later of the date the contractor gets the notice or the date the employer returns the performance security. That timeline makes sure the contractor has time to plan their exit, knowing their financial collateral is safe.
Now we get to the core difference, the compensation. Under default, the contractor gets penalized. Under convenience, how is the contractor made whole?
This is all covered under the valuation subclause for convenience. The contractor submits the detailed particulars for valuation, which includes the value of work done and so on. But critically, this submission must also include the amount of any loss of profit or other losses and damages suffered by the contractor as a direct result of this no-fault termination.
That inclusion of loss of profit, that's the clearest signal that this is non-punitive. The employer has to actually compensate the contractor for the revenue and profit they stood to make if they'd finished the project.
Precisely. The engineer then determines the amount, issues a payment certificate, and the contract dictates a clear and relatively short payment timeline.
And that payment timeline is radically different from the default scenario where the funds can be held indefinitely.
Oh, yes. For termination for convenience, the employer has to pay the certified amount within a specific period, 112 days after the engineer receives the contractor's submission. It's designed for a quick financial disentanglement, so the contractor isn't left in limbo.
So the core distinction is vital for anyone managing or performing under the Yellow Book. Default is all about compensating the employer, seizing assets, withholding funds, and imposing penalties.
Right, and limiting valuation strictly to compliant work. Whereas convenience is focused entirely on compensating the contractor, including their lost profit and the quick return of their performance security. It makes sure the employer pays the full price for changing their mind mid-project.
That structural distinction should inform every single decision, especially when you're thinking about issuing that first notice to correct. And here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. Under termination for convenience, the employer is explicitly prohibited from executing the works with anyone else until the contractor has been paid the agreed compensation. The contract literally forces the employer to pay for the breakup before they can even start working on their replacement plan.